So, Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen. These were the series' first remakes, serving as updated versions of the original Pokémon Red and Green. Yeah, they changed the localized names for the originals, but not the remakes, it's kinda weird. Which came out only 8 years earlier in 1996. These days, it would probably seem a bit ridiculous to remake a game that, at the time, wasn't even a decade old. For reference sake, this would be equivalent to remakes of Pokémon Sword and Shield coming out next year. Or last year, if we're comparing it specifically to the Western localizations of the Gen 1 games. It really goes to show how much longer development cycles have gotten since the 90s and 2000s. Remember when there was a new Mario Kart game every 2 or 3 years? However, back then, it did somewhat serve a purpose. Not only were the sound and graphical upgrades a lot more drastic than they would be within that exact same time frame today, not only was this the only way to legitimately obtain a lot of Kanto Pokémon during Gen 3 due to it being impossible to transfer Pokémon from the Game Boy games, but also, despite the far smaller time difference, in terms of core gameplay mechanics, a lot more has changed about this series between Gens 1 and 3 than between Gen 3 and today. If a modern player were to try and revisit the originals, you'd have to explain to them how a bunch of features and mechanics they're used to are missing, or may not work how they expect them to. For FireRed and LeafGreen, you might have to tell them about the lack of a physical special split, and that's about it. These also serve as an important milestone for my review series, as we are officially entering my era. Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen are the first set of games I'm covering in one of these videos that I actually grew up with. I got a cartridge of Pokémon Leaf Green used in the early 2010s, for weirdly cheap from what I remember. I hope this isn't a bootleg. It was probably the game I replayed the most times, since because my DS had a GBA slot, it was easy for me to transfer out any Pokémon I liked and reset the game without really losing anything. And some of the very first videos I ever uploaded to YouTube on one of my many previous attempts at starting a channel were a terrible camcorder let's play of that game.
Okay. Hi YouTube, this is my very first Pokemon Let's Play.
So I guess for these entries, I'm not only going to be seeing how they hold up next to the rest of the series, but also how they hold up for me personally. Compared to my video on Red and Blue, my coverage on the bulk of FireRed and LeafGreen probably isn't going to be quite as thorough. For most of the adventure, these really are the exact same games except rebuilt on the Gen 3 engine. So, for better or for worse, there's going to wind up being a lot of overlap in what I have to say. Some content has been added, but what was already there has been left mostly untouched. Same storyline, same map layout, most trainers, both randoms and bosses, use the same teams, there have been very minimal changes to the availability of certain Pokémon, and a lot of the improvements are kind of to be expected, using the Gen 3 battle system and quality of life. I don't think most people need to be told it's a good thing that, say, the move Wrap doesn't work the way it used to, or that the player's inventory is no longer one long unorganized list. Like when I talked about Yellow, this is largely going to focus on measuring how much they succeed in being an improvement over the originals, and whether it's enough for them to justify themselves. This time round, I elected to pick Bulbasaur, who's probably my favorite Kanto starter. The other Pokemon I wanted to catch for my team weren't available until a good bit into the adventure, but it hardly mattered, because Bulbasaur pretty much trivializes the entire early game. Even if he ran into a type disadvantage, he could easily just stall them out with Sleep Powder and Leech Seed. The only trainers who could still be a little annoying were all those Grass-type girls I shouted out in my Gen 1 videos. They are about the only part of Kanto that can ever make picking Charmander a little tempting, but thankfully, this time round I was able to avoid most of them. As usual, I'm playing with a few self-imposed rules that may affect my experience with, ergo my opinions of the game, so for clarity's sake, I play on set mode, I don't use healing items in battle, I don't like to overlevel too much, I don't use legendary Pokemon, and I like to have a full squad of 6 before the credits roll. Anyway, just like the originals, it takes virtually no time to get past the early game fetch quest, and within about 10 minutes of gameplay, we're at the first gym. With how faithful these remakes are, it was unfortunately pretty inevitable that they would inherit a lot of the problems I had with the original games, and probably the place where this is most obvious is in the battles. Even ignoring the obvious Gen 3 upgrades to the battle system, it is definitely an improvement. The opposing trainers do tend to have better AI, most Pokemon are able to get decent, somewhat diverse movesets now, especially since a lot of the best TMs are in infinite supply from pretty early on. Yeah, you do have to rely on the game corner, but not only is it a lot easier to grind money and simply buy coins in this game due to the addition of the Versus Seeker, allowing you to rematch random trainers pretty much whenever you wish, compared to Ruby and Sapphire, I find the slot machines in this game actually kind of work. I don't know if it's just apophenia, but I felt like in this game I could actually time when I stopped the wheel spin and get matches somewhat consistently. I don't know, I could actually win these ones somewhat frequently when I couldn't win the ones in Hoenn ever, so they work differently somehow. That being said, it still took me like half an hour to win enough coins for one TM, so I would still strongly recommend just buying the coins instead. Also, some of the Gen 3 upgrades address some of my criticisms with Gen 1 in a more direct manner. One of my problems with the Kanto Pokédex is that many of them were a bit too samey in terms of what they did in battle, so the addition of abilities and special being split into two different stats adds a bit more diversity between Pokemon of the same type. Like, for example, the Thick Fat ability actually gives you a reason to have Dugong on your team, when originally they were just an objectively weaker version of Lapras. However, you may remember from my Gen 1 videos that a lot of my issues with the battles in those games didn't even come from the pretty lackluster battle mechanics, or move pools, or AI, but rather with the lineups used by the opposing trainers. The roster of Pokemon available in the early game is somehow even weaker than it was in the originals, as for some reason you are no longer able to catch Nidoran before the first gym. But not to worry, because the first gym leader, Brock, might somehow be even more of a joke than he was back in Gen 1. I guess he at least has a Rock-type move now, but because Rock Tomb is considered speed control rather than a regular attack, his AI isn't super inclined to use it. And since the move Bind has been rightfully nerfed, he can no longer be cheap with that. And this trend not only continued, but may even have gotten more pronounced throughout the rest of the game. Mostly having the exact same lineups, the gym leaders tended to have the same lack of diversity in what their team members were weak to, and as far as I could tell, none of them really took advantage of the wider move pools that were available. So they're all still very easily swept as a result. Misty's Starmie is still one of the bigger early game threats, but in a battle system where they can no longer crit every other turn, they're far more manageable than they used to be. Surge's Pokemon still can't do shit to ground or grass types. Similar to Brock, Erica can no longer be cheap with Wrap. Psychic types can still be a little overpowered because, even though Dark and Steel types exist in this game, the only one available in the main adventure is Magneton. However, Sabrina's whole team can still easily get blown up by a speedy physical attacker, especially now that you can teach them Shadow Ball. And Blaine and Giovanni are both still just use Surf simulators. Giovanni in particular was actually really nerfed from his previous appearance. Not only can he no longer get lucky and just delete one of your Pokemon from the battle by landing a Fissure, they also changed his Rhydon into a second Rhyhorn. I have no idea why they thought especially the latter was necessary. The only gym battle I found somewhat memorable in this playthrough was Koga. I didn't have any psychic types for his coughings or wheezing, and I also happened to be very underleveled when I fought him, and it actually made this battle a lot more strategic and fun for me, even with him being a heal-spamming piece of shit. It got me kinda wanting to play an entire game like this. Maybe something for a future video. With this being a near one-to-one remake of a game I've talked about previously, you probably aren't expecting me to have wildly different thoughts on the game's main storyline. To briefly recap, I think the story is pretty patchy, I think the map design of the Kanto region is pretty messy, and I feel the human characters largely coast on being the first of their series archetype in order to be memorable. Blue remains the one exception. I think he's a fun rival. The main place the adventure differs from the original games is in the side quests. There are actually a few in FireRed and LeafGreen. The first is catching the legendary bird trio, and this is one of the very few parts of these remakes that I actually think is measurably worse than it was in the originals. You may remember in my video on Red and Blue, one of the few positives I had for those games compared to the rest of the series was that the legendary Pokémon had far more reasonable catch rates. As long as you could endure an attack or two from them, you could get them statused, which would usually allow you to catch them within a few balls. This, of course, was changed in Gen 2, where status conditions would now only increase your odds by 1% or 2, if at all, and that became the norm for the rest of the series. I've gotten a few comments pointing out the irony in being someone who makes a lot of Pokemon-themed content that doesn't like catching Pokemon that much, but I really do struggle to understand what there is to like about this gameplay mechanic, especially in the context of legendary Pokemon. There was a bit in a recent video from the channel JRose11 that kind of spelled out for me why I don't really enjoy this part of the game, why I was so fast to just boycott roaming legendaries entirely after my gold and silver video, and why part of me is genuinely tempted to do the same for normal legendaries. There are a couple of other things in this series that I've criticized for being unnecessarily tedious, but with the level grind before fighting Red in the Johto games, or even with purifying all of the Shadow Pokemon in Colosseum, no matter how slow it is, you are noticeably making progress. There is an end in sight. No such metric exists when catching legendary Pokemon. The 10,000th ball you throw has the exact same odds as the first one you threw. Articuno took ages, but eventually cooperated. Zapdos decided to be nice and only took 2 or 3 balls. Moltres took so long that after breaking out of all 35 or so Ultra Balls that I had on 3 different attempts, I just completely gave up and threw the Master Ball at them. It might not seem like a great decision to use it here, but honestly, unless you're going for the roaming legendary beast that pops up in the post-game, which I absolutely am not, there really isn't a better time. There are more legendaries to catch later on, but for a reason I'll explain in a bit, catching them isn't quite as bad, at least in terms of how long it takes. The second major side quest is filling in the Pokédex. Even in most casual playthroughs of FireRed and LeafGreen, I would strongly recommend doing a light version of Professor Oak's challenge right from the start of the game, because unlike the rest of the series, where you're just given a digital diploma for completing the entire thing, this time you're actually given tangible in-game rewards for catching certain amounts of Pokemon. This actually existed in the originals as well, but I didn't really find it worth talking about because the rewards were kind of bad and not worth it, but here they can be quite helpful. Catching 10 Pokemon gives you the Flash HM, catching 20 gives you the Everstone, catching 30 gives you the Item Finder. It's pretty useless for finding normal hidden items, but there are a couple of helpful items like the Leftovers that can only be found this way. Catching 40 gives you the Amulet Coin, a held item that doubles the prize money you get after winning a battle. Very helpful if you're grinding for a Game Corner TM or something. Catching 50 gives you the EXP Share, an item that allows you to give experience to a Pokemon without sending them out in battle. You know, back before that was the norm, and catching 60 unlocks something that becomes relevant a bit later. I did a lot of my catching in the Safari Zone, since I was planning on catching a team member there anyway, and it really served as a reminder how much that place sucks. Kangaskhan was already quite rare, and I had to encounter like 5 or 6 of them before I was able to catch one before she ran away. Advanced Safari Zone tip, though, that I definitely didn't discover, but I did figure out for myself. Spin your character in place instead of walking around, and you can get as many encounters as you want without running out of steps. The third side quest is new to the remakes, and was easily the single biggest change that was made from the originals outside of the expected Gen 3 upgrades. After beating Blaine's gym, Bill, the PC guy, comes up and asks you to come along to help him with an errand. I think a lot of people who played this game, my younger self included, never even realized this whole section is completely optional, but you can just say no to him initially, after which he'll wait in the Pokemon Center and you can activate the quest at any time, or just completely ignore him and go finish the rest of the main adventure. Just keep in mind, after accepting the quest, you won't be able to switch out your party until it's completed. Doing this doesn't get you a whole lot right now. If you decide to go with Bill, he'll take you to a new location called the Sevi Islands, and they become important later in the game, but right now all you do here is a fetch quest. I think they just wanted to spread out the battles between the 7th and 8th gym leaders a little bit. I will say, though, they do pull a bit of an "oh no, I dropped the lift key" with one particular NPC. The guy you're supposed to give the meteorite to doesn't automatically accept it after the cutscene with him. You have to talk to him again separately. I wouldn't call this one a flaw in game design. You are told from the start you have to give that item to that guy, but the first time I played this game as a kid, I actually got lost here for ages, and thought I was going to be stuck on these islands forever because I just wasn't paying attention. Back in Gen 1, the Pokémon League was pretty much the only part of the game that I didn't consider to be a total joke in terms of difficulty, and their spike in strength compared to the gym leaders has only gotten more drastic in the remakes. Despite being even more underleveled when I faced them in Blue version, I won on my first try, but this time round it took me 5 or 6 attempts. I've addressed this before, but I get a fair amount of comments from people asking why I always fight the Elite Four at such a low level instead of grinding. And the answer is that I just find it more engaging this way. My interest isn't in making the game as easy for myself as possible. If it was, I would be playing on Switch mode, and I wouldn't be banning myself from using healing items in battle. Even when I lose in ways that are kind of frustrating, and would probably have been prevented if my Pokemon was at a higher level, or if I broke my self-imposed rules, to me that's still preferable to just being bored, which is how I feel while grinding, or feeling cheap, which is how I feel while heal spamming or playing on Switch mode. So far in this series, I've made a point of fighting every boss at whatever level I happen to be, and only resorting to grinding when progress is basically impossible otherwise, and at least for now, I intend to keep it that way. This time round, the only member of the Elite Four who was a bit easier for me was Lance, because I had Dugong to take down his Dragonite. She is outsped and misses the one-shot with Ice Beam, although she had a pretty cool combo attack where she could first use Icy Wind, which would not only chip Dragonite into KO range, but also lower Dragonite's speed, allowing Dugong to go first and knock him out next turn. The only other member I never lost to was Bruno, but I wouldn't exactly say he was free. My team happened to not match very well into rock or fighting types, especially since my flying type, Aerodactyl, didn't learn a stronger flying type move than Aerial Ace or Fly, so I did have to rely on Venusaur stalling his Pokemon out with Leech Seed sometimes. I lost to Lorelei twice. Jolteon could just blast through most of her team. The problem was actually her Slowbro, of all things. She would usually survive Jolteon's first attack, and then start spamming Amnesia and becoming basically undefeatable. Agatha gave me quite a bit of trouble too, and I lost to her once. My luck against her was not great. Many cases of my Pokemon missing at inopportune times, just barely not hitting damage ranges, hitting themselves in confusion, her constantly hitting the 60% accurate Hypnosis and the Sleep lasting a really long time. Like I said in the Gen 1 video, she's known as the Agatha Lottery for a reason. Only unlike in those games, this time round her Pokemon actually have decent firepower in addition. Carrying over from the originals, the champion battle against the rival is still by far the best boss fight in the game. Even if I still find it a little underwhelming on paper, that the final battle is just a stronger version of the same team you've been repeatedly fighting throughout the whole game, at least that team is varied, pretty well composed, and by the time of this final confrontation, all fully evolved, which is a higher bar than most any of the other bosses in this game clear. I lost my first attempt against him, partially just from being dumb. In my effort to get Venusaur in against Rhydon on a move that wasn't Earthquake, I instead got Rock Tomb, which lowered Venusaur's speed and allowed Rhydon to go first and KO with Earthquake the next turn, so I was down a Pokemon with literally no benefit whatsoever. The rest of that attempt went especially poorly as well. Exeggutor survived on literally 1 HP after Overheat, and then was annoying with Light Screen and Sleep Powder for like 20 turns afterwards, but I think after that dumb opening, the fight was already pretty much lost regardless. On my second attempt, I played smarter by not losing my Venusaur for no reason, and setting up Exeggutor for a 2-shot with Flamethrower instead of going for the Oko with Overheat, and that basically made all the difference in the end. I had to make a couple of other precarious plays, like putting Gyarados to sleep to make sure I got a safe switch into Jolteon, and then having Jolteon effectively kamikaze to get Alakazam paralyzed, so Kangaskhan could safely get the KO, but once those two were dealt with, Aerodactyl had an easy KO on the Ace Charizard with Ancient Power, and we'd won. However, unlike the original games, we're not quite done yet. Remember the Sevi Islands from earlier? We were only able to visit 3 of them earlier, but as it turns out, there are not 3 Sev-E islands, but in fact, 9. I mean, if you count the 2 event-exclusive islands, there are technically 9, but I guess only 7 of them are inhabited. And these are where the bulk of the FireRed and LeafGreen post-game take place. If you wish to play the post-game of FireRed and LeafGreen, what was previously a mere side quest becomes mandatory. You need to unlock the National Pokédex, and Oak will only give this to you if you've caught at least 60 different kinds of Pokémon. This is why I recommended spreading this out throughout the game, because if you've left it till now, it's a pretty big task to do it all at once. The storyline of the post-game is nothing too special for the most part. Some of it I'm pretty sure was originally meant to be part of the main adventure, but wound up getting moved, based on the levels of the first few rocket grunts you fight. These would be somewhat appropriately leveled if the player had 7 badges, like they probably would on their first visit to these islands, but not after beating the League. There's another bit where they require you to teach a whole additional HM move for literally 1 obstacle. This waterfall in Icefall Cave is the only one in the entire game, and you only ever have to come here for 1 story moment, where I think for the first time a member of the Elite Four actually plays a role in the plot outside of the Pokemon League. Lorelei helps you deal with some Team Rocket grunts accused of poaching local Pokemon. There is a minor character called Gideon, who I actually find kind of memorable and funny because of how amoral he is, tailing us and swiping the MacGuffin we were looking for before we can get it, but then assuring us we can just steal it from Team Rocket after he sells it to them, and even gives us some of the information we need in order to do it. He was also notable for being the last NPC I had to talk to complete Giovanni's entry in the Fame Checker. I haven't mentioned this thing before now. It might be one of the least used key items in the history of the series, but basically, it's a bunch of character profiles you can fill in, with an entry for pretty much every NPC with a unique sprite, aside from the rival, even Daisy Oak. You know, the girl who optionally gives you the town map. You fill it in by talking to random NPCs or reading random signs around the region that happen to give lore about the character. Giovanni's is particularly easy to fill in, because the NPCs you interact with to do so are all conveniently grouped up in the areas where you encounter Team Rocket anyway, with Gideon being the only one you have to go out of your way to find, since he will only give you his Fame Checker dialogue if you complete the post-game quest and then come back to talk to him again afterwards. After filling in a character's profile, you are rewarded with an extra line of dialogue. So yeah, I think I can see why most people don't really bother with this. This should have been a way to rematch the gym leaders or something. The last notable thing about the post-game storyline is that it does briefly change this game from a remake into a bit of a prequel. While you're in the Team Rocket warehouse on 5 Island, there are a couple of references to plans that would come to fruition in the Johto games. The 2 admins you fight here are widely believed to be the same 2 from the Goldenrod Radio Tower takeover, who are known as Ariana and Archer in the Johto remakes, but are unnamed as of this point in the series, and Gideon mentions that Giovanni has a son with red hair, the first hint towards that character's identity. Once that little quest is completed, there's not a whole lot else to do in the post-game. At this point in the series, it was starting to become the norm to include battle facilities in the base games, but the one in FireRed and LeafGreen is kinda crappy. There's this place called Trainer Tower, where if you are able to win 8 battles in a row, not without changing your lead, you can switch the order of your party at any time. Not without healing, you can use as many potions and revives as you want in between or even during battles. Not within a time limit, you can take as long as you want. You can win one of the items that allows you to evolve a Gen 1 Pokemon into a Gen 2 Pokemon via trading. Yeah, no thanks. There are a couple of other little side quests, like helping this girl find her way out of Lost Cave, or there's a strength puzzle which unlocks this place called the Tenobi Ruins, where you can catch Unown. Lastly, there are a couple more legendary Pokemon you can catch. There's the Mewtwo in Cerulean Cave, returning from Gen 1, one of the legendary beasts from Gen 2 begins roaming the region, which I refuse to even attempt to capture, and if you were to obtain the items Aurora Ticket and Mystic Ticket, which were distributed at events in the original cartridges, but available normally in the recent digital re-releases, you could also capture a Ho-Oh and a Lugia on Naval Rock, and a Deoxys on Birth Island. So, if you wanted a Ho-Oh in Generation 3, and didn't want to complete the challenge that I consider to be one of the worst experiences in all of Pokemon, this was how you did it. I was not thrilled about the idea of having to catch 4 more legendary Pokemon in this game. However, I found out that, only in the post-game, this vendor on 2 Island begins selling Timer Balls. For those who didn't see my Ruby and Sapphire review, Timer Balls were basically the saving grace of catching legendary Pokemon in those games. It's only when you have these that you technically are making progress the longer a legendary encounter goes on, as Timer Balls become more effective the higher the turn count is. They do cap off at a certain point, but it's only around turn 12 where they surpass the best regular Pokeballs in effectiveness. With these, capturing Mewtwo, Ho-Oh, and Lugia was no trouble at all next to the legendary bird trio. Deoxys was still a bit of a struggle. Nothing to do with Pokeballs, really, although my luck with those wasn't great in this particular fight either. It was more that Deoxys, for some reason, was only level 30, making it very difficult to weaken without accidentally KOing. Even when I went back to fill my team with a bunch of level 20 and 30 scrubs that I'd caught while trying to fill my Pokedex, it was still annoying, because in this form Deoxys has maybe the weakest defensive stats out of any Pokemon. Really, how is Deoxys even alive with these stats? It seems like one quick attack from a Rattata would just blow them up instantly. After completing the Team Rocket storyline in the postgame, you can return to the Pokemon League, where for the first time in the series, the Elite Four and Champion can actually be rematched with different, stronger teams. From a story perspective, I wish this was framed a little differently. For the most part, the characters in here still act as if you're fighting them for the first time, when it would probably make a bit more sense if this was portrayed as you defending your title, but whatever, not that important. This time round, I definitely was not going to win at the level I happened to be, but fighting the Elite Four on repeat is usually the most efficient way to level up anyway. I would generally play each attempt as if I was actually trying to win, but to make sure I wasn't burning all of my resources on doomed attempts, I would only start fully healing between battles when it started to look like I had a realistic chance. It made grinding a lot less boring than it was the previous times I've had to resort to it, and again, I was actually having a bit of fun trying to find ways of maximizing my chances at these lower levels. I found myself using pivoting strategies, which normally only come up in difficult Nuzlockes. I obviously lost to Lorelei and Bruno a few times while training, but the vast majority of the time my runs were stopped at Agatha. I figured until my Jolteon and Aerodactyl could outspeed her team, I would just be relying too much on luck. She was also the only one I lost to after I started seriously trying to win. Even once I was a bit more appropriately leveled, my luck against her was somehow even more absurdly terrible than it was in my first run of the Elite Four. It was getting to the point where I would prematurely start to narrate the worst possible thing that could occur on each turn, and it would just happen as I was saying it.
Alright, I think you're guaranteed to wake up this turn, so Overheat should KO, but with the luck I've been having, it'll probably miss. Yep, what am I even making, you don't even need me to make these predictions, you know exactly what's gonna happen every time.
On that one turn I missed with Overheat alone, I had a 90% chance of winning that battle that didn't go in my favor, and that's not even accounting for the 100 other points across my several attempts at this fight where the odds went against me. Also, due to some kind of bug or oversight, Lorelei and Agatha's previously all-female teams have been changed to all-male. I assume this was unintentional, unless Game Freak meant to imply that Lorelei and Agatha went and caught entirely new teams instead of leveling up the Pokemon they already had. Or, who knows, maybe they were trying to be ahead of the curve with trans representation. Either way, this actually wound up impacting my chances because it meant Agatha's male Misdreavus could spam Attract on my mostly female team. And at this point, you probably don't even need me to tell you that they got immobilized by Attraction on almost every single possible turn. Once again, Lance was probably the easiest one for me, although I wasn't able to play all that aggressively against him. His most difficult Pokemon was actually Aerodactyl. He knows Earthquake now, so I couldn't just take him on with Jolteon this time. I ended up having to lower his attack stat as much as I could by switching back and forth a few times to get a few Intimidates off with Arcanine, which allowed my own Aerodactyl to safely 1v1 as long as he didn't get crit. Finally, we get back to Blue, who, like the Elite Four, has a slightly different team for the rematch. My opening for this fight was actually something I thought of a while ago, while trying to come up with a specific niche for Aerodactyl in this game after seeing a video claiming he didn't really have one. The rival leads with Heracross, and I lead with Aerodactyl. Aerodactyl takes out Heracross, which baits in Gyarados. The opposing trainers will send in the Pokemon with the most effective move and the least effective typing. Gyarados can only go for Hydro Pump, which allows me a completely safe switch into Jolteon, since she would take even a crit Hydro Pump, and allows Jolteon to get the free KO on Gyarados. This does only come up in the post-game, which a lot of people don't bother with, but I think allowing for two 100% consistent, completely free KOs on the final boss is a solid enough niche. The rival sends in Charizard next, and I switch back to Aerodactyl. To be clear, the potential Nuzlocke line has ended now. This switch isn't safe at all. Aerodactyl would just go down to a crit Fire Blast. The first one misses, but because I'm so low leveled, Rock Slide doesn't quite get the one shot, so he probably would have lost this 1v1 otherwise. Next up is the rival's other new Pokemon, a Tyranitar. This Tyranitar is actually in some ways a hindrance to the rest of the champion's team, as none of the rival's other Pokemon are immune to the sandstorm damage he brings in. I let Aerodactyl go down after getting off an Earthquake in order to get a safe switch. Kangaskhan can't quite win the 1v1 due to the rival healing, but is able to set up an easy KO for Venusaur on the next turn. Now, the rival sends in his Alakazam, and this is easily the Pokemon I was most worried about, because not having a Psychic type myself, I have no resists on my team. I let Venusaur go down to get a safe switch, and do another effective Kamikaze, this time with my Dugong, in order to get a Toxic off. I send in Jolteon next, and between Bite, Sandstorm damage, and Toxic damage, Alakazam goes down. I had the KO regardless, but as an added bonus, Alakazam flinches from Bite. The 1v1 between my last Pokemon in the back, Arcanine, and the rival's last Pokemon, Exeggutor, was already likely to go in my favor, but with Jolteon still on the field, I can make it somewhat likelier. It was a tough call, whether to go for chip damage or status. In the end, I go for status, which, looking back, I think was the wrong call. Flamethrower was pretty close to being an OHKO. The only lose condition here is if Arcanine gets put to sleep, and stays asleep for like 4 or 5 turns. Which surely doesn't happen, right? At some point, I probably should do a thing where I subvert the audience's expectations and recap a whole epic battle, only for it to be a loss attempt. But that day is not today. Exeggutor just gets fully paralyzed, and the rival tries heal stalling for a bit, but to no avail. Probably got a bit lucky with that Fire Blast miss, as well as Jolteon getting that Bite flinch on Alakazam, plus full paralysis on Exeggutor. It's likely I needed at least one, if not both of those to get the win. But honestly, after those Agatha fights, I was owed some luck in this Elite Four. Arcanine finishes off Exeggutor with extreme speed, the rival has his whole third act breakdown again, our team is re-entered into the Hall of Fame, and we are completely finished with Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen. FireRed and LeafGreen are, by default, a pretty substantial improvement over the original Gen 1 games, just by virtue of being built from the Gen 3 engine. However, I do find that for the vast majority of the game, that's kind of it. Obviously, Kanto is more enjoyable with the changes that were made to the battle system and quality of life in the entries since Red and Blue. Better type chart, better move pools, abilities, held items, the way stats are calculated makes more sense. Better organized menus, HMs can be deleted now. But at the end of the day, it is still Kanto. Even looking at the region in this more polished form, playing this right next to Ruby and Sapphire really highlights how small and empty, and in some ways, kinda dull this place is. Outside of the Elite Four, the boss fights are all still complete jokes. Outside of the rival, and I guess now Gideon, I still find most of the characters pretty flat and unmemorable. Even the newly added post-game is basically just an elongated fetch quest. To me, FireRed and LeafGreen have always been a very second monitor set of games. I guess you could say that about most entries in this series, at least to a degree, but compared to the other ones I grew up with, these especially were ones that I often only half paid attention to while watching YouTube or something like that on another screen, just so I was doing something with my hands. The game rarely demanded a whole lot more than that. For those reasons, I'm kind of questioning whether I should even rank them above the Gen 2 games. I think I will, but I guess I kind of expected a little more from these games than that even being up for debate. Well, one more game on the GBA, and it's one that I've been rather looking forward to. I just hope it delivers.